They say a mother's love is unconditional, that no matter what your children do, no matter how far they stray, that bond remains unbreakable. I believed that once. I lived by it for 62 years, through sleepless nights with colicky babies, through teenage rebellion, through watching my children make choices that broke my heart but never my devotion. I believed it right up until the moment my son Michael pulled over on Highway 94, turned to me in the back seat still wearing my mother of the bride dress, and told me to get out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where every good story should, with the truth about who I was before everything changed. My name is Patricia Ann Sullivan, though most people in Clearwater just called me Patty. I was born in 1962 to Irish Catholic parents who believed in hard work, honest living, and the kind of love that shows itself through actions rather than words. I married my high school sweetheart, James Sullivan, when I was 21, and we spent the next 40 years building what I thought was a beautiful life together. James was a contractor, the kind of man who could fix anything with his hands and had calluses that told the story of every honest dollar he'd ever earned. I worked part-time at the local elementary school as a teacher's aide while raising our 3 children, Michael, born in 1985, Sarah in 1987, and our youngest, Danny, in 1990. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. More importantly, we were happy, or so I thought. The house we lived in was a modest 2-story colonial that James had essentially rebuilt from the foundation up over our first decade of marriage. Every room held memories of birthdays celebrated, homework supervised, scraped knees bandaged, and dreams shared over family dinners. The kitchen was my domain, with its cheerful yellow walls and the breakfast nook where I'd served thousands of meals to my growing family. James had installed the cabinets himself, painted every wall, and even built the swing set in the backyard where our children had spent countless summer afternoons. We weren't just parents. We were partners in every sense of the word. When James started his own construction company, Sullivan and Sons, I handled the books, answered phones, and coordinated schedules from our dining room table. The name was optimistic. James hoped both Michael and Danny would join the family business someday. Michael showed promise early on, spending summers working alongside his father, learning to swing a hammer and read blueprints. Danny was more academically inclined, but he'd help out when needed, usually handling the business side of things during his college breaks. Sarah was my shadow in those early years. She'd follow me around the house, helping with laundry, learning to cook, playing with dolls while I worked on the company paperwork. She was the child who still called me mommy well into middle school, who saved her allowance to buy me flowers on Mother's Day, who wrote thank you notes without being asked. If you'd told me then that she would someday sit silently while her brother abandoned me on a country road, I would have laughed at the impossibility of it. But children grow up, and sometimes they grow away from the values that shaped them. Michael left for college with grand plans of studying business, claiming he wanted to modernize Sullivan and Sons, take it national. He had big dreams and bigger ambitions. And while James and I were proud of his drive, there were moments when his enthusiasm felt less like passion and more like impatience with our small-town way of doing things. Still, he was our firstborn, and we supported his education even when it meant taking out a second mortgage on the house. Sarah went to community college for nursing, but dropped out after meeting Kevin Hartley, a charming young man from what people in Clearwater called old money. The Hartleys owned the largest car dealership in the county and lived in the kind of house that had its own name, Hartley Manor. Sarah was swept off her feet by Kevin's attention, his expensive gifts, and the promise of a life far removed from our middle-class existence. They were engaged within 6 months, married within a year, and Sarah transformed from my down-to-earth daughter into someone I barely recognized. Danny, our youngest, was the one who seemed to stay closest to our roots. He studied accounting, at the state university, but always came home for holidays, still helped with yard work when he visited, and talked about moving back to Clearwater after graduation to help grow the family business. He was the child I thought would take care of us in our old age, the one who still hugged me goodbye when he left for school. James and I were proud of all three of our children, even as we watched them pursue paths we didn't entirely understand. We told ourselves that we'd raised them well, given them strong foundations, and that whatever choices they made, they'd always remember where they came from. We were naive in the way that good parents often are, believing that love and proper upbringing were enough to guarantee loyalty and respect. The first crack in our family foundation appeared in 2018, when James was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at the age of 58. It was a devastating blow that came without warning. One day, he was the sharp, capable man who could estimate material costs in his head and manage multiple construction projects simultaneously. And the next, he was struggling to remember the names of clients he'd worked with for years. The progression was cruel in its unpredictability. Some days, James seemed almost like his old self, sharp and present and able to handle business decisions. Other days, he'd get lost driving to job sites he'd visited hundreds of times, or forget conversations we'd had just hours earlier. I became his constant companion, his memory, his translator when words failed him. Sullivan and Sons began to suffer, as I spent more time caregiving and less time managing the business. This should have been when our children stepped up. This should have been when the family we'd built with so much love and sacrifice rallied together to support each other through the hardest challenge we'd ever faced. Instead, it became the moment when their true characters were revealed. Michael, who had graduated with his business degree and was working for a consulting firm in Chicago, started visiting more frequently, but not to help with his father's care. He came with spreadsheets and projections, talking about maximizing assets and strategic downsizing. He'd sit at our kitchen table, the same one where I'd helped him with homework for 12 years, and explain to me like I was a child that maintaining the business and the house was financially irresponsible, given James's condition. "Dad's not getting better, Mom," he'd say with the cold pragmatism he'd learned in business school. "We need to be realistic about the future. The company's losing money, the house needs constant repairs, and you're burning through savings trying to keep everything afloat. There are excellent care facilities that specialize in Alzheimer's patients. Dad would get better care, and you could start fresh somewhere more manageable." Sarah, now Mrs. Kevin Hartley and living in her mansion across town, would nod along during these conversations. She'd arrived at our house in her luxury SUV, dressed in clothes that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, playing the role of the concerned daughter while clearly uncomfortable in the modest home where she'd grown up. Her suggestions were always couched in concern for my well-being, but they all involved selling everything James and I had built together. "Mom, you look so tired," she'd say, reaching across the table to pat my hand with her perfectly manicured fingers. "This is too much for you to handle alone. Maybe Michael's right about exploring other options. Kevin knows people who work in senior living, and some of these places are really beautiful, like luxury resorts." Only Danny seemed to understand. What they were really suggesting, that I abandon the man I'd loved for 40 years, sell the home we'd built together, and dissolve the business that had supported our family for decades. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But Danny was still in school, still dependent on us financially, and his protests carried little weight against his older siblings' unified front. The conversations always followed the same pattern. Michael would present his analysis of our financial situation, complete with charts and graphs showing how we were bleeding money. Sarah would offer emotional support for the difficult but necessary decisions we needed to make. And I would listen politely, thank them for their concern, and then continue caring for James exactly as I always had. What they didn't understand, what they never bothered to ask about was that I wasn't just James's wife. I was his business partner, his co-owner, and the person who'd been managing Sullivan and Sons' finances for 20 years. I knew exactly how much money we had, where it was invested, and how long it would last. I also knew something they'd apparently forgotten in their rush to plan our future, that I wasn't some helpless elderly woman who needed their permission to make decisions about my own life. But I kept these thoughts to myself because I still believed in the fundamental goodness of my children. I told myself they were just worried about me, that their suggestions came from a place of love even if they didn't feel that way. I reminded myself that watching a parent decline with dementia was traumatic for adult children, and maybe their desire to fix the situation was their way of coping with the helplessness we all felt. I was still making excuses for them when James died. It happened on a Tuesday morning in March 2022. I'd gotten him dressed and settled at the kitchen table with his coffee and the newspaper, just like every morning for the past 4 years. He was having a good day. He'd recognized me immediately when he woke up, had asked about the weather, and was attempting to read the sports section with the kind of focused concentration that reminded me of the man he used to be. I was in the laundry room, loading towels into the washing machine when I heard the sound. Not a crash or a cry for help, just the soft thud of something heavy hitting the floor. By the time I reached the kitchen, James was already gone. The doctor would later tell me it was a massive heart attack, that he wouldn't have felt any pain, that it was actually a merciful way for someone with his condition to pass. But in that moment, kneeling beside my husband on the kitchen floor where we'd shared so many meals and conversations and quiet morning moments, mercy was the last thing on my mind. I called 911, then sat with James while we waited for the paramedics, holding his hand and talking to him even though I knew he couldn't hear me. I told him about the grandchildren he'd never gotten to meet, about the business deals that were still pending, about how proud I was of the life we'd built together. I told him I loved him, had always loved him, would always love him. And then the paramedics arrived, and the medical examiner, and suddenly our kitchen was full of strangers asking me questions I didn't want to answer about procedures I didn't want to understand. Michael arrived first, having driven down from Chicago as soon as I called. He took charge immediately, handling phone calls and paperwork and all the practical details that come with death. Sarah came next, bringing flowers and casseroles and the kind of dramatic grief that made everything about her own loss. Danny flew in from college that evening, red-eyed and quiet, the only one of my children who seemed to understand that we'd lost the center of our family. The wake was held at Morrison Funeral Home, the same place where we'd said goodbye to James's parents years earlier. James looked peaceful in the casket I'd chosen, a simple oak model that reflected his practical nature rather than the elaborate mahogany coffin the funeral director had tried to sell me. The viewing room was packed with friends, neighbors, and business associates, all sharing stories about James's kindness, his work ethic, his devotion to family. Michael stood beside me in his expensive black suit, shaking hands and accepting condolences with the polished demeanor of someone accustomed to networking events. Sarah cried elegantly into designer tissues, accepting sympathy from the church ladies who remembered her as a sweet little girl. Danny stayed close to the casket, as if he couldn't bear to be too far from his father even in death. I felt disconnected from it all, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. People kept telling me how sorry they were for my loss, how James was in a better place now, how I should take comfort in knowing he was no longer suffering. But I didn't want comfort. I wanted my husband back. I wanted the life we'd planned together, the quiet retirement we'd dreamed about, the chance to grow old together in the house he'd built for us. The funeral the next day was a blur of prayers and hymns and well-meaning words about God's plan and eternal rest. James was buried in Clearwater Cemetery, in a plot we'd purchased together years earlier, never imagining I'd be choosing the headstone inscription so soon. I threw the first handful of dirt onto his casket, and with it, I felt like I was burying not just my husband, but the woman I'd been for 40 years. After the service, people came back to our house for lunch. The dining room table groaned under the weight of casseroles, salads, and desserts brought by neighbors and church members. Our living room filled with the quiet conversations of people who weren't sure what to say, but knew they should be there. I moved through it all like a ghost, thanking people for coming, accepting their sympathy, playing the role of the grieving widow even though I felt too empty for grief. It was during this gathering, while I was in the kitchen washing dishes and trying to find some sense of normalcy in the familiar routine, that I overheard the conversation that would change everything. Michael and Sarah were standing in the hallway just outside the kitchen, speaking in the hushed tones people use at funerals. I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping. I was simply trying to stay busy, to keep my hands occupied so my mind wouldn't have time to fully process what had happened. But their words cut through my numbness like ice water. "We need to move quickly," Michael was saying. "The business has outstanding contracts, and if Mom tries to fulfill them herself, she'll run it into the ground. Better to sell the client, list, and equipment while they still have value." "What about the house?" Sarah asked. "It's worth more than I expected, especially with Dad's renovations. Kevin knows a real estate agent who specializes in quick sales." "The sooner the better," Michael agreed. "Mom's not thinking clearly right now, which is understandable, but we can't let her make decisions that will hurt her long-term financial security. If we handle this right, she'll have enough money for a nice retirement community and maybe something left over for emergencies." "She won't like it," Sarah said, and I could hear the worry in her voice. "You know how stubborn she can be about change." "She'll come around," Michael replied with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no by his mother. "Especially when she realizes she doesn't have any other choice. Dad left everything to her, but that doesn't mean she's capable of managing it all. We're doing this for her own good." I stood at the kitchen sink, my hands submerged in soapy water, and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. They weren't talking about helping me through my grief, or supporting me as I figured out how to live without James. They were talking about dismantling my life, about making decisions for me as if I were already incompetent, about handling me like I was a problem to be solved rather than their mother who'd just lost her husband. The worst part wasn't their assumption that I couldn't manage without them. The worst part was the casual way they discussed it, as if my feelings and preferences were irrelevant obstacles to be overcome. They'd already decided what was best for me, already made plans for my future, already chosen to see me as a burden, rather than a person deserving of respect and autonomy. I finished washing the dishes in silence, my movements mechanical and precise. When the last guest had left and we were alone in the house that suddenly felt too quiet, too empty, too full of memories, my children gathered around the kitchen table where we'd shared so many family meals. It was time, they said, to discuss practical matters. Michael had brought his laptop, just as he had during all those earlier conversations about James's care. Sarah had a notepad and what she called some preliminary research about my options. Danny sat quietly, looking uncomfortable, but not objecting to what was about to unfold. "Mom," Michael began, his voice gentle but firm. "We know this is a difficult time, but there are some decisions that can't wait. Dad's gone, and that means you're going to have to make some changes to how you live." I looked at my eldest son, this man I'd raised from a baby, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged and whose homework I'd supervised and whose college tuition I'd helped pay, and I said nothing. I wanted to hear exactly what they thought my future should look like. "The business is the biggest concern," he continued, consulting notes on his laptop screen. "Dad had 3 major contracts in progress, plus ongoing maintenance agreements, with several commercial clients. You can't handle that kind of workload alone, and if you try, you'll lose money and damage the company's reputation. Better to sell while the client relationships are still intact." Sarah nodded along, adding, "And the house is really too much for you now, Mom. All those stairs, The big yard, the constant maintenance issues. Dad was always fixing something, and you don't have those skills. It would be smart to sell while the market is good and find something smaller, more manageable. There are some really beautiful retirement communities around here, she continued, pulling out brochures from her purse. Kevin's looked into several of them. They have activities, social groups, medical care on site. You'd have so much less to worry about, and you'd be around people your own age. I listened to them lay out their vision of my future. Sell the business, sell the house, move to a senior living facility, and essentially retire from the life I'd built with their father. They presented it as concern for my well-being, as practical solutions to real problems, as the obvious next steps for a woman who'd just been widowed. What they didn't account for was that I knew things they didn't know. Things James and I had never shared with our children because we'd believed in handling our own affairs, in not burdening them with details about money and business and plans for the future. They didn't know, for instance, that Sullivan and Sons wasn't just James's company. My name was on all the legal documents as co-owner and partner. They didn't know about the life insurance policy that would pay off the house and leave me comfortable for the rest of my life. They didn't know about the investment accounts James and I had been contributing to for decades, or the rental properties we owned in the next county over, or the fact that I'd been the one managing the company's finances and knew exactly which contracts were profitable and which clients were reliable. Most importantly, they didn't know that James and I had already made plans for this possibility. We'd discussed what would happen if one of us died first, how the surviving spouse would manage the business, whether to sell or hire help or transition to a smaller operation. James had spent his final lucid months making sure I understood every aspect of Sullivan and Sons, from the equipment inventory to the supplier relationships to the seasonal fluctuations in revenue. But I didn't share any of this information with my children that night. Instead, I told them I needed time to think, that I was too overwhelmed with grief to make major decisions, that we should revisit the conversation in a few weeks when I was thinking more clearly. They accepted this with the patience of people who believed they'd already won, who saw my request for time as a temporary delay rather than potential resistance to their plans. Michael said he'd stay in town for a few more days to help with immediate concerns, and Sarah offered to start researching retirement communities more seriously. Danny just nodded along, still the baby of the family, still deferring to his older siblings' authority. After they left that night, I sat alone in the kitchen where James and I had shared our last morning together. The house felt different without him, not just empty, but somehow smaller, as if his presence had been what made it feel like home. I made myself a cup of tea and tried to process everything that had happened in the space of just 3 days. James's death, the funeral, and now my children's plans to reshape my entire existence. The grief was still there, a constant ache in my chest that made breathing feel like work. But underneath the sadness, something else was growing. A cold, clear anger at being treated like a child by my own children, at having my intelligence and competence dismissed so easily, at being seen as a problem to be solved rather than a person deserving of respect. I thought about James, about how proud he'd been of the business we'd built together, of the house he'd renovated with his own hands, of the life we'd created in this small town where everyone knew our names. I thought about the clients who trusted Sullivan and Sons to do quality work at fair prices, about the employees who depended on us for steady jobs, about the legacy we'd hoped to leave behind. And I thought about my children, who seemed to have forgotten that I was the woman who'd managed household budgets and school schedules and business appointments for decades, who'd successfully run the administrative side of a construction company, while raising 3 kids, who'd cared for their father through 4 years of devastating illness without losing my mind or my dignity. They saw me as frail, as overwhelmed, as incapable of making sound decisions about my own life. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next morning, I called Vincent Martinez, the lawyer who'd handled our business incorporation and wills. I made an appointment for that afternoon, and when Michael asked what I was doing, I told him I was meeting with Vincent to understand the legal implications of James's death, which was true, just not complete. Vincent had been a friend of ours for 15 years, a sharp, honest man who'd helped us navigate every major legal decision in our business. His office was in a converted Victorian house on Main Street, and when I arrived that Thursday afternoon, he greeted me with genuine sympathy and professional discretion. "Patty," he said, gesturing for me to sit in the comfortable chair across from his desk. "I'm so sorry about James. He was a good man, and I know this must be incredibly difficult for you." "Thank you, Vincent. It is difficult, but I'm managing." I settled into the chair and looked him directly in the eye. "I need to understand exactly what I own, what I control, and what my options are." Vincent nodded, pulling out a thick file folder. James was very thorough in his planning, especially after his diagnosis. "Let me walk you through everything." For the next hour, Vincent explained the details of James's will, the structure of our business partnership, the various accounts and properties we'd accumulated over 4 decades of marriage. Everything James had owned was now mine. The house, the business, the life insurance proceeds, the investment accounts, everything. Moreover, since I'd been co-owner of Sullivan & Sons from the beginning, there were no legal complications about my right to continue operating the company. "Your children don't have any legal claim to the business or your personal assets," Vincent explained. "James left everything to you outright, with the understanding that you'd make your own decisions about how to handle it all." "What if I wanted to continue running Sullivan & Sons?" I asked. "What would that look like practically?" Vincent smiled. "Well, you've been running the business side of it for years already. The main challenge would be the physical labor and project management that James handled. But there's nothing stopping you from hiring foremen or subcontractors to handle that side of things. Several of your current employees are experienced enough to step into supervisory roles." We discussed the specifics of the existing contracts, the financial health of the company, and the various options for moving forward. By the time I left Vincent's office, I had a clear understanding of my situation, and it was very different from what my children had assumed. I was not a helpless widow who needed their guidance and protection. I was a financially secure business owner with decades of experience and a clear legal right to make my own decisions about my future. The question was whether I wanted to fight for the life James and I had built, or whether it would be easier to give my children what they wanted and start over somewhere else. That night, I sat in James's favorite chair in our living room, surrounded by photos of our life together, wedding pictures, family vacations, birthdays and graduations, and ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable when they were happening, but now felt precious beyond measure. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard after the funeral, about my children's casual dismissal of my capabilities, about their assumption that they knew what was best for me better than I knew myself. And I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I was not going to be managed, handled, or pushed aside by anyone, not even my own children. I was going to fight for what James and I had built together, and if that meant disappointing my children's expectations, so be it. They'd underestimated me, patronized me, and planned my future without bothering to ask what I wanted. They were about to learn that their mother was stronger, smarter, and more stubborn than they'd ever imagined. The next few weeks passed in a careful dance of deception. I let Michael and Sarah believe I was considering their suggestions while I quietly made my own plans. I met with Vincent several more times to understand all my legal options. I had lunch with Tom Bradley, James's longtime foreman, to discuss the possibility of him taking over the field operations if I decided to keep Sullivan & Sons running. I visited our banker to review our financial situation and ensure I understood every aspect of our accounts and investments. Most importantly, I started documenting everything, every conversation with my children, every assumption they made about my capabilities, every plan they made for my future without consulting me. I had a feeling I was going to need evidence of their attitudes later. Michael stayed in town for 2 weeks, ostensibly to help with immediate business concerns, but actually to pressure me into making the decisions he wanted. Every few days, he'd bring up the need to move quickly on selling the business, on listing the house, on exploring retirement communities. His patience was wearing thin, and his requests were becoming more insistent. Sarah visited frequently, as well, armed with brochures for senior living facilities and real estate comparisons for houses in our neighborhood. She'd taken it upon herself to research my options thoroughly, and she presented her findings with the enthusiasm of someone who thought she was being incredibly helpful. Danny was more supportive, but he was also the least influential of my 3 children. When he suggested that maybe I should take more time to decide, or that perhaps I was more capable than his siblings were giving me credit for, Michael and Sarah would shut him down with the authority of older siblings who'd never learned to see him as an equal. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in early April, 6 weeks after James's funeral. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when Michael arrived unannounced, letting himself in through the back door as if he still lived there. He was carrying his laptop and wearing the expression of someone who'd decided it was time to stop being patient. "Mom," he said, setting his computer on the kitchen table. "We need to talk. You've had plenty of time to adjust, and now it's time to make some decisions. I've got buyers interested in the business equipment, and Sarah's found 3 retirement communities that have immediate openings. We can't keep putting this off." I looked at my oldest son, this man who'd once been the little boy who'd helped me bake cookies for his school bake sales, who'd cried when he'd accidentally stepped on a butterfly, who'd told me I was the best mom in the world when I'd stayed up all night helping him finish a science project. And I realized that somewhere along the way, that loving child had turned into a stranger who saw me as an obstacle to his plans rather than a person deserving of respect. "Sit down, Michael," I said quietly. "There are some things we need to discuss." He sat, opening his laptop with the confidence of someone who thought he was about to close a deal. "Good. I'm glad you're ready to be practical about this. The sooner we get everything sorted out, the sooner you can start your new life." "My new life," I repeated, pouring myself a cup of coffee and remaining standing while he sat. "Tell me more about this new life you've planned for me." Something in my tone must have alerted him, because he looked up from his computer screen with a slightly puzzled expression. "Well, the retirement community Sarah found has great reviews. They have activities, medical care, social opportunities. You'd be much happier there than trying to maintain this place on your own. And you've decided I can't maintain this place on my own because..." Michael's expression shifted from puzzled to slightly irritated. "Mom, be realistic. You're 62 years old. You've never run a construction business by yourself. And this house requires constant upkeep. Dad handled all of that. Without him, you're in over your head." I set my coffee cup down carefully and looked at my son, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in years. "Michael, who do you think handled the payroll for Sullivan and Sons? Who scheduled the jobs, ordered materials, managed client relationships, handled the accounting, filed the taxes, and kept track of every expense and revenue stream for the past 20 years? He blinked, clearly not understanding where I was going with this. "Well, you helped Dad with the paperwork, but..." "I didn't help your father with the paperwork," I interrupted, my voice still calm but with an edge that made him sit up straighter. "I was his business partner. My name is on every legal document, every bank account, every contract. I've been running the administrative side of Sullivan and Sons since before you graduated high school." Michael's confident expression was starting to crack. "But the physical work, the project management, can be handled by hiring qualified foremen and subcontractors, just like every other successful construction company does when it expands beyond what the owner can personally oversee." I sat down across from him, meeting his eyes directly. I've already spoken with Tom Bradley about taking over field operations. I've reviewed our current contracts and our financial position. I know exactly what Sullivan and Sons is worth, what our profit margins are, and what it would take to keep the company running successfully. The silence stretched between us as Michael processed this information. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. But, Mom, even if you could manage the business, what about the house? What about your social needs? Wouldn't you be happier around people your own age? I'm 62, not 92, I replied evenly. I have friends here, a community I've been part of for 40 years, and a house that your father built with his own hands. Why would I give all of that up to live in an institution with strangers? Michael's jaw tightened, and I could see him, struggling to maintain control of the conversation that wasn't going the way he'd planned. It's not an institution, it's a retirement community, and you're not thinking clearly about the financial realities. Maintaining this house and running a business is expensive. What if you make a mistake? What if you can't handle the stress? What if I'm not the incompetent old woman you've apparently decided I am? I finished for him. Michael, I've been managing money, solving problems, and handling stress for longer than you've been alive. Your father and I built a successful business from nothing while raising 3 children. I think I can figure out how to continue living my own life. That's when the mask finally came off, and I saw my son's true feelings about my resistance to his plans. His face flushed with anger, and when he spoke, his voice carried the condescending tone I'd heard him use with his subordinates at work. Fine, he snapped. If you want to be stubborn about this, that's your choice. But don't come crying to me when you're overwhelmed and broke and wishing you'd listen to reason. Sarah and I are trying to help you, but if you'd rather struggle on your own than accept good advice, that's on you. He started to close his laptop, clearly intending to storm out, but I wasn't finished with this conversation. Michael, I said quietly, there's something else we need to discuss. He looked up, still angry but curious despite himself. Your father's will, I continued. I assume you've seen a copy of it. Of course. Dad left everything to you, which is why we need to help you figure out how to manage it all. I nodded slowly. That's interesting, because Vincent Martinez tells me that no one from our family has contacted his office to request a copy of the will or to schedule a reading, so I'm curious about where you think you saw this document. Michael's face went pale, and I watched him realize that he'd made an assumption, a very dangerous assumption, about information he didn't actually possess. We just assumed. You assumed that your father would leave everything to me, which he did. But you never actually verified that, did you? You never bothered to find out if there were any specific bequests to you children, any particular instructions about the business, any requests about how I should handle his estate. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice conversational. For all you know, James left specific instructions that Sullivan and Sons should never be sold, that the house should stay in the family, that his life's work should be preserved exactly as he built it. You've been making plans for my future without even knowing what your father wanted for his legacy. Michael was now looking genuinely worried, as well he should have been. What? What did Dad's will actually say? I smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. That's between me and Vincent Martinez. What I can tell you is that your father trusted me to make the right decisions about our life's work. He didn't include detailed instructions because he knew I understood his values, his priorities, and his hopes for the future. I stood up, signaling that this conversation was over. I've made my decision, Michael. I'm keeping the house and continuing to run Sullivan and Sons. If you can't support that decision, if you can't treat me with the respect I deserve as your mother and as a competent adult, then perhaps it's time for you to go back to Chicago and focus on your own life. Michael stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling between his desire to keep arguing and his growing realization that he'd fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Finally, he closed his laptop and stood up. "This is a mistake, Mom," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "You're going to regret this decision, and when you do, I hope you remember that Sarah and I tried to help you." "I'll remember that you tried to control me," I replied calmly. "There's a difference." After he left, I sat alone in my kitchen and felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of someone who refuses to accept reality, but the steady, determined hope of someone who's decided to 3 months. After my confrontation with Michael, life had settled into a new rhythm. Sullivan and Sons was thriving under the arrangement I'd made with Tom Bradley, who proved to be an excellent field supervisor. Our clients were happy, our employees felt secure, and I was discovering a confidence in business decisions that I'd never fully recognized when James was alive. The house, far from being the burden my children had predicted, felt more like home than ever. I'd hired a local teenager to help with yard work, and I was managing the maintenance issues just fine with the help of reliable contractors I'd known for years. But the peace didn't last. The storm that would ultimately destroy my relationship with my children was gathering strength, centered around an event that should have been a celebration: Sarah's second wedding. It turned out that Sarah's marriage to Kevin Hartley hadn't been the fairy tale she'd imagined. Kevin had a gambling problem that had cost them their house, her car, and most of their savings. The divorce had been finalized in February, leaving Sarah financially devastated and emotionally shattered. She'd moved back to Clearwater, renting a small apartment across town and working part-time at a boutique while she tried to rebuild her life. During this period, Sarah seemed to rediscover some of the qualities I'd always loved about her. She visited me regularly, not to pressure me about my living situation, but simply to spend time together. We'd sit in the kitchen where she'd grown up, drinking coffee and talking about everything except her failed marriage and my refusal to follow her and Michael's advice about selling the business. It felt like having my daughter back, the sweet, thoughtful girl who'd once been my closest companion. Sarah met David Chen in July at a community theater production where she was volunteering with costumes and he was working as the sound technician. David was recently divorced himself, a software engineer who'd moved to Clearwater for a fresh start after his own marriage had ended badly. He was quiet, kind, and seemed genuinely smitten with Sarah from their first meeting. Their relationship moved quickly, which should have been a warning sign given Sarah's pattern of rushing into commitments when she was vulnerable. But David seemed different from Kevin. He was employed, responsible, and appeared to have no interest in Sarah's family's money or connections. When Sarah brought him to Sunday dinner in August, I found myself cautiously optimistic about her choice. David was polite and respectful, asking thoughtful questions about the construction business and listening attentively when I talked about James and our early years together. He seemed genuinely interested in Sarah's family history, and he treated her with a gentleness that was refreshing after witnessing the casual cruelty of her marriage to Kevin. Michael was less impressed when he met David during a brief visit in September. Over dinner at our kitchen table, he grilled David about his career prospects, his financial situation, and his long-term plans with the kind of intensity usually reserved for job interviews. Sarah looked mortified by her brother's behavior. But David handled the interrogation with good humor and honest answers that satisfied even Michael's suspicious nature. The engagement was announced in October, with a wedding planned for the following March. Sarah was determined to do things differently this time: a smaller ceremony, a modest reception, and none of the elaborate pretensions that had characterized her first wedding. She asked me to help with the planning, and I found myself enjoying the process in a way I hadn't expected. This would be my chance to give Sarah the kind of wedding I'd wanted for her the first time, before the Hartley family had taken over the planning and turned it into a showcase for their wealth and social status. This wedding would be about love, family, and the simple joy of two people making a commitment to each other. I offered to host the reception at our house, which had enough space in the backyard for a modest gathering and would save them significant money on venue costs. Sarah was delighted with the suggestion, and David seemed genuinely touched by the gesture. We spent hours planning the details: where to set up tables, how to arrange flowers from my own garden, which family recipes to use for the catering. Michael expressed concern about the cost and logistics of hosting a wedding at the house, but he grudgingly agreed to help with the preparations. Danny, now graduated from college and working as an accountant in Philadelphia, was enthusiastic about the plan and offered to take time off work to help with setup and coordination. As the wedding date approached, I found myself happier than I'd been since James's death. I was playing a meaningful role in my daughter's new beginning. I was surrounded by family preparing for a celebration, and I was using the house James had built to create memories that would last for generations. The guest list was small, about 40 people, including family, close friends, and a few of David's relatives who were traveling from California for the ceremony. The week before the wedding was a whirlwind of activity. Sarah had taken vacation time from her job to focus on final preparations, and she was at the house every day helping with cleaning, decorating, and coordinating with the various vendors we'd hired. Michael arrived from Chicago on Wednesday, bringing his new girlfriend, Amanda, a sharp-tongued investment banker who seemed perpetually bored by our small-town preparations. Danny drove down from Philadelphia on Thursday, and for the first time in months, all of my children were under the same roof. It should have been a joyful reunion, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite identify. Michael and Sarah seemed to be having whispered conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room, and Danny looked uncomfortable in a way that reminded me of childhood moments when his siblings had excluded him from their plans. The rehearsal dinner was held Friday night at Giuseppe's, the Italian restaurant where James and I had celebrated our own anniversary every year. It was a small gathering, just the immediate family, the wedding party, and David's parents who'd flown in from San Francisco. The evening should have been perfect, but I noticed that Michael seemed distracted, checking his phone frequently and barely participating in the conversations around him. Sarah looked radiant in a simple blue dress, her happiness genuine and infectious. David's parents were lovely people who shared stories about their son's childhood and expressed gratitude for the warm welcome they'd received from our family. Danny gave a heartfelt toast about new beginnings and the importance of family support during life's transitions. When Michael finally stood to speak, his toast was polite but oddly formal, focusing more on general wishes for happiness than on any personal connection to his sister or her new husband. I felt a chill of unease, but Sarah seemed too caught up in the joy of the evening to notice her brother's subdued demeanor. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, with the kind of perfect spring weather that makes you believe in good omens. I was up early, making final preparations in the kitchen and checking on the flowers I'd arranged throughout the house. Sarah arrived at 7:30 with her maid of honor, her friend Lisa from work, and they transformed our living room into a bridal preparation space complete with makeup, hairstyling tools, and the kind of excited chatter that accompanies important occasions. I helped Sarah into her dress, a simple but elegant ivory gown that she'd found at a consignment shop and had altered to fit perfectly. She looked beautiful, more beautiful than she had at her first wedding when she'd been draped. Inexpensive designer everything, but had seemed somehow diminished by the grandeur. This Sarah was confident, glowing, and genuinely happy in a way that reminded me of the little girl who'd once twirled around our kitchen in dress-up clothes, declaring that she was going to marry someone who would love her forever. The ceremony was held in our backyard, with David's uncle, who was an ordained minister, officiating under an arch of spring flowers that Danny and I had constructed earlier that week. The 40 guests were seated in white folding chairs arranged on the lawn, with a simple aisle marked by rose petals leading to the altar area. I walked Sarah down the aisle, a role I'd insisted on despite her initial protests that it should be Michael's honor as the man of the family. But Michael was serving as David's best man, and I wanted to be the one to give my daughter away to the man who would hopefully treasure her the way she deserved. As we walked slowly across the grass, toward David, who was waiting with tears in his eyes, I felt James's presence so strongly it was almost like he was walking beside us. The ceremony was perfect in its simplicity. Sarah and David had written their own vows, speaking to each other with honesty and tenderness about their hopes for the future, their commitment to supporting each other through whatever challenges they might face, and their gratitude for having found love when they'd both thought it might not be possible again. There wasn't a dry eye among the guests when they were pronounced husband and wife. The reception that followed was everything I'd hoped it would be. Tables scattered around the backyard were loaded with food prepared by Giuseppe's catering service, supplemented by desserts I'd made myself using recipes that had been in our family for generations. A small band played music that ranged from classic love songs to contemporary pieces that got even the older guests dancing on the makeshift dance floor Danny had created by laying plywood over a section of the lawn. I spent the afternoon moving among our guests, playing hostess in the house where I'd raised my children and sharing stories about Sarah's childhood with David's relatives. Everyone commented on how beautiful the setting was, how personal and meaningful the celebration felt, and how obvious it was that this marriage was built on genuine love rather than social expectations or financial considerations. Michael seemed to relax as the day progressed, dancing with Amanda and even sharing a genuine moment of laughter with Sarah during the father-daughter dance that he performed in James's absence. Danny appointed himself the unofficial photographer, capturing candid moments throughout the celebration with the kind of attention to detail that suggested he understood the importance of preserving these memories. As evening approached and the reception began winding down, I felt a deep satisfaction about the role I'd played in making Sarah's second chance at happiness as special as it deserved to be. The house had been filled with joy and love, the kind of celebration James would have approved of, and I'd proven to myself that I was capable of managing significant events without needing my children's guidance or oversight. David's parents approached me as they were preparing to leave, expressing their gratitude for the beautiful wedding and the warm welcome they'd received. "Sarah is so lucky to have a mother who would do all this for her," David's mother said, embracing me warmly. "You can see how much love went into every detail." After the last guests had departed and the catering staff had finished cleaning, my children and I sat on the back porch, tired but happy, sharing leftover wedding cake and reviewing the highlights of the day. Sarah was still glowing with happiness, curled up next to David on the porch swing, while Danny showed off photos he'd taken throughout the celebration. Even Michael seemed genuinely pleased with how everything had turned out, admitting that hosting the reception at home had been a better choice than he'd initially thought. It was during this peaceful moment, as we sat surrounded by the remnants of a perfect day, that Sarah made the announcement that would change everything. "I have something to tell all of you," she said, her voice taking on the careful tone people use when they're about to share news they're not sure how others will receive. "David and I have been talking, and we've decided we want to move to California. His company has offered him a promotion that would require relocating to their headquarters in San Jose, and we think it's a great opportunity for both of us to start fresh." The silence that followed her announcement was heavy with implications that I don't think she fully understood. Michael's expression shifted from post-wedding contentment to something more calculating, while Danny looked genuinely surprised and a little hurt that Sarah hadn't mentioned this possibility to him earlier. "When?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the sinking feeling in my stomach. "Probably in about 3 months," David answered. "The company wants me to start the new position in June, which would give us time to get settled before Sarah looks for work out there." "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it, even though the prospect of having Sarah so far away filled me with loneliness I didn't want to acknowledge. "It sounds like a great opportunity for both of you." Sarah looked relieved by my response, but Michael's reaction was more complex. "California's expensive," he said thoughtfully. "Have you looked into housing costs, living expenses, all of that?" "We've done some research. David replied. The salary increase will help, but you're right that it's going to be tight at first. We're planning to rent a small apartment initially and see how things go. What about a down payment for a house eventually? Michael pressed. California real estate prices are insane. You'll probably need significant help to ever become homeowners out there. I could see where this conversation was heading, and I felt the first stirrings of the familiar anger that had become my constant companion whenever my children started making assumptions about my resources and responsibilities. Michael wasn't just making conversation about Sarah's move. He was laying groundwork for a request that would involve my money. Sarah seemed to realize it too, because she quickly interjected, "We're not asking for help, Michael. We'll figure it out on our own." "Of course you will," Michael agreed smoothly. "But there's no shame in accepting family support when it's available. Mom's in a good financial position now, and I'm sure she'd want to help her daughter get established in a new place." The presumption in his statement took my breath away. Not only was he volunteering my money without consulting me, but he was doing it in a way that made it seem like refusing would be selfish and unloving. The worst part was that I could see Sarah wavering, clearly tempted by the possibility of financial help, even though she'd just insisted she didn't need it. "That's generous of you to offer my resources," I said to Michael, my voice carrying a sharp edge that made everyone look at me more closely. "But perhaps Sarah and David should discuss their financial needs directly with me, rather than having you negotiate on their behalf." Michael had the grace to look embarrassed, but he didn't back down entirely. "I wasn't negotiating anything, Mom. I was just pointing out that you have the means to help if you choose to, and that there's nothing wrong with families supporting each other during major transitions." "Family supporting each other," I repeated, slowly. "That's an interesting concept, Michael. Tell me, when was the last time you supported me during a major transition?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see all three of my children processing the implications. Sarah looked confused. Danny looked uncomfortable. And Michael looked like he was trying to decide whether to address my question, directly or deflect it somehow. "Mom," Sarah said carefully, "if this is about the business and the house, we were just trying to help after Dad died. We were worried about you." "Were you worried about me, or were you worried about protecting assets you assumed you'd inherit?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the fury building inside me. "Because there's a difference, and I'm no longer sure which one motivated your concerns." Danny, who had remained quiet throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should talk about this another time. It's been a long day, and Sarah's wedding should be about celebrating, not about family disagreements." He was right, of course, but the moment had revealed something that couldn't be ignored or postponed. My children's attitudes toward me, toward my money, and toward their roles in my life were fundamentally problematic, and pretending otherwise wasn't going to solve anything. "You're absolutely right, Danny," I agreed. "This conversation can wait. Sarah, congratulations again on a beautiful wedding. You and David should focus on your new life together and not worry about anything else right now." Sarah looked relieved, but still troubled, clearly sensing that there were undercurrents to this conversation that she didn't fully understand. David, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics, looked like he wished he could disappear entirely. Michael was studying me with the expression of someone who was beginning to realize he'd made a tactical error. The evening ended with hugs and congratulations, but the easy camaraderie we'd shared earlier had been replaced by a tension that felt familiar from the weeks following James's funeral. As I cleaned up the remaining dishes and put away the decorations, I found myself thinking about patterns, how my children seemed to view me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected, how they made assumptions about my willingness to fund their choices, and how quickly they shifted from treating me like an incompetent burden to treating me like a convenient bank account. The next morning, Michael knocked on my door early, ostensibly to say goodbye before driving back to Chicago, but actually to continue the conversation we'd started the night before. I invited him in for coffee, curious to see how he would approach the subject of Sarah's move and my potential financial contribution to it. "About last night," he began, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "I think there might have been some miscommunication about my intentions." "Really?" I poured coffee for both of us and sat down across from him. "What did you intend that I misunderstood?" "I wasn't trying to volunteer your money or make commitments on your behalf," he said, his tone carefully reasonable. "I was just observing that you have the resources to help Sarah if you choose to, and that it might be something worth considering." "And why do you think it's worth considering?" I asked. "What makes you believe that Sarah's housing situation in California should be my financial responsibility?" Michael looked genuinely puzzled by the question, as if the answer should be obvious. "Because she's your daughter, and you have the money to help her. Why wouldn't you want to support her new start?" "I might want to support her," I replied, carefully. "But I don't appreciate having that decision assumed and discussed as if my agreement was a foregone conclusion. Sarah didn't ask me for help. You suggested it without consulting either of us first." "I was just trying to be practical," Michael said, his patience beginning to wear thin. "Sarah's too proud to ask for money directly, but she's going to need help whether she admits it or not. I thought if I brought it up in a casual way, it would be easier for everyone to discuss." "Easier for everyone, or easier for you to control the conversation?" I asked. "Michael, in the past year, you've tried to convince me to sell my business, sell my house, and move to a retirement community. You've questioned my ability to manage my own affairs and made plans for my future without consulting me. Now you're volunteering my money to fund Sarah's relocation. Do you see a pattern here?" Michael's jaw tightened, and I could see him struggling to maintain his diplomatic facade. "I see a pattern of trying to help my family make good decisions. Is that supposed to be a bad thing?" "It depends on whether you're actually helping or whether you're trying to control," I replied. "Help involves asking what someone needs and respecting their autonomy to make their own choices. Control involves deciding what's best for someone else and then pressuring them to comply with your decisions." "Fine," Michael snapped, his mask finally slipping. "If you don't want to help Sarah, that's your choice, but don't pretend this is about my attitude when it's really about you being selfish with money that you can't take with you anyway." There it was, the real Michael, the one who saw my resources as something that rightfully belonged to him and his siblings, and my reluctance to spend my money according to his priorities as selfishness rather than prudent financial management. This was the son who had tried to convince me to liquidate everything I owned so he could invest the proceeds according to his judgment, who saw my independence as an inconvenience and my autonomy as an obstacle to his plans. "Michael," I said, quietly, "I think it's time for you to go back to Chicago, and I think it's time for you to seriously consider whether you see me as your mother or as an asset to be managed." He stared at me for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to continue the argument or cut his losses and leave. Finally, he stood up, his expression cold and distant. "I see you as my mother," he said. "But I also see someone who's become bitter and suspicious of everyone who cares about her. Dad wouldn't recognize the person you've become." The cruelty of using James against me, of suggesting that my dead husband would disapprove of my refusal to be manipulated, hit me like a physical blow. But it also clarified something important about Michael's character and his willingness to use emotional warfare to get what he wanted. "Your father," I said, my voice steady despite the pain his words had caused, "built a business and a life based on the principle that people should earn what they have and respect other people's right to make their own choices. He would absolutely recognize the person I've become, because I'm finally becoming the person he always knew I could be." Michael left without saying goodbye, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the windows. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded, by the remnants of Sarah's wedding celebration and felt the last of my illusions about my children's motivations finally crumble away. Sarah called that afternoon to apologize for the awkward conversation the night before and to clarify that she and David hadn't asked Michael to speak on their behalf about financial assistance. She sounded genuinely distressed about the tension between Michael and me, and she asked if there was anything she could do to help resolve the situation. "There's nothing to resolve," I told her gently. "Michael and I have different perspectives on family relationships and financial boundaries. That's not your responsibility to fix." "But Mom," she said, her voice small and worried, "I don't want my wedding to be the thing that caused problems in our family." "Your wedding was beautiful, and it didn't cause any problems," I assured her. "The problems were already there. Your wedding just happened to be the occasion when they became visible." We talked for another few minutes about her move to California, and I made it clear that while I would miss her terribly, I supported her decision and wished her happiness in her new life. I also made it clear that if she and David needed financial help, they should ask me directly rather than having Michael or anyone else negotiate on their behalf. After we hung up, I spent the rest of the day thinking about the conversation with Michael and what it revealed about the fundamental breakdown in our relationship. He saw me as someone whose primary value lay in my ability to fund his family's various needs and ambitions. When I refused to play that role automatically, he responded with manipulation, guilt trips, and eventually outright cruelty. This wasn't the behavior of a loving son who was concerned about his mother's welfare. This was the behavior of someone who felt entitled to control and benefit from someone else's resources, and who became angry when that control was challenged. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call that would prove to be the beginning of the end of my relationship with my children. Michael was studying me with the expression of someone who was beginning to realize he'd made a tactical error. The evening ended with hugs and congratulations, but the easy camaraderie we'd shared earlier had been replaced by a tension that felt familiar from the weeks following James's funeral. As I cleaned up the remaining dishes and put away the decorations, I found myself thinking about patterns, how my children seemed to view me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected, how they made assumptions about my willingness to fund their choices, and how quickly they shifted from treating me like an incompetent burden to treating me like a convenient bank account. The next morning, Michael knocked on my door early, ostensibly to say goodbye before driving back to Chicago, but actually to continue the conversation we'd started the night before. I invited him in for coffee, curious to see how he would approach the subject of Sarah's move and my potential financial contribution to it. "About last night," he began, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "I think there might have been some miscommunication about my intentions." "Really?" I poured coffee for both of us and sat down across from him. "What did you intend that I misunderstood?" "I wasn't trying to volunteer your money or make commitments on your behalf," he said, his tone carefully reasonable. "I was just observing that you have the resources to help Sarah if you choose to, and that it might be something worth considering." "And why do you think it's worth considering?" I asked. "What makes you believe that Sarah's housing situation in California should be my financial responsibility?" Michael looked genuinely puzzled by the question, as if the answer should be obvious. "Because she's your daughter, and you have the money to help her. Why wouldn't you want to support her new start?" "I might want to support her," I replied, carefully. "But I don't appreciate having that decision assumed and discussed as if my agreement was a foregone conclusion. Sarah didn't ask me for help. You suggested it without consulting either of us first." "I was just trying to be practical," Michael said, his patience beginning to wear thin. "Sarah's too proud to ask for money directly, but she's going to need help whether she admits it or not. I thought if I brought it up in a casual way, it would be easier for everyone to discuss." "Easier for everyone, or easier for you to control the conversation?" I asked. "Michael, in the past year, you've tried to convince me to sell my business, sell my house, and move to a retirement community. You've questioned my ability to manage my own affairs and made plans for my future without consulting me. Now you're volunteering my money to fund Sarah's relocation. Do you see a pattern here?" Michael's jaw tightened, and I could see him struggling to maintain his diplomatic facade. "I see a pattern of trying to help my family make good decisions. Is that supposed to be a bad thing?" "It depends on whether you're actually helping or whether you're trying to control," I replied. "Help involves asking what someone needs and respecting their autonomy to make their own choices. Control involves deciding what's best for someone else and then pressuring them to comply with your decisions." "Fine," Michael snapped, his mask finally slipping. "If you don't want to help Sarah, that's your choice. But don't pretend this is about my attitude when it's really about you being selfish with money that you can't take with you anyway." There it was, the real Michael, the one who saw my resources as something that rightfully belonged to him and his siblings, and my reluctance to spend my money according to his priorities as selfishness rather than prudent financial management. This was the son who had tried to convince me to liquidate everything I owned so he could invest the proceeds according to his judgment, who saw my independence as an inconvenience and my autonomy as an obstacle to his plans. "Michael," I said, quietly, "I think it's time for you to go back to Chicago, and I think it's time for you to seriously consider whether you see me as your mother or as an asset to be managed." He stared at me for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to continue the argument or cut his losses and leave. Finally, he stood up, his expression cold and distant. "I see you as my mother," he said, "but I also see someone who's become bitter and suspicious of everyone who cares about her. Dad wouldn't recognize the person you've become. The cruelty of using James against me, of suggesting that my dead husband would disapprove of my refusal to be manipulated, hit me like a physical blow. But it also clarified something important about Michael's character and his willingness to use emotional warfare to get what he wanted. "Your father," I said, my voice steady despite the pain his words had caused, "built a business and a life based on the principle that people should earn what they have and respect other people's right to make their own choices. He would absolutely recognize the person I've become because I'm finally becoming the person he always knew I could be." Michael left without saying goodbye, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the windows. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of Sarah's wedding celebration, and felt the last of my illusions about my children's motivations finally crumble away. Sarah called that afternoon to apologize for the awkward conversation the night before, and to clarify that she and David hadn't asked Michael to speak on their behalf about financial assistance. She sounded genuinely distressed about the tension between Michael and me, and she asked if there was anything she could do to help resolve the situation. "There's nothing to resolve," I told her gently. "Michael and I have different perspectives on family relationships and financial boundaries. That's not your responsibility to fix." "But Mom," she said, her voice small and worried, "I don't want my wedding to be the thing that caused problems in our family." "Your wedding was beautiful, and it didn't cause any problems," I assured her. "The problems were already there. Your wedding just happened to be the occasion when they became visible." We talked for another few minutes about her move to California, and I made it clear that while I would miss her terribly, I supported her decision and wished her happiness in her new life. I also made it clear that if she and David needed financial help, they should ask me directly rather than having Michael or anyone else negotiate on their behalf. After we hung up, I spent the rest of the day thinking about the conversation with Michael and what it revealed about the fundamental breakdown in our relationship. He saw me as someone whose primary value lay in my ability to fund his family's various needs and ambitions. When I refused to play that role automatically, he responded with manipulation, guilt trips, and eventually outright cruelty. This wasn't the behavior of a loving son who was concerned about his mother's welfare. This was the behavior of someone who felt entitled to control and benefit from someone else's resources, and who became angry when that control was challenged. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call that would prove to be the beginning of the end of my relationship with my children. Any profits would be distributed according to ownership percentages. "And if the investments lose money?" I asked. "If your business school expertise doesn't translate into successful returns? What happens to my $2 million then?" Michael's confidence wavered slightly. "All investments involve risk, but I've done extensive research into the opportunities I'd pursue. The potential for significant returns far outweighs the risks." "That's what every failed investor in history has believed," I replied. "Michael, what you're proposing is that I hand over the majority of my liquid assets to you, trusting that your investment decisions will generate returns that benefit me more than simply keeping the money in the diversified portfolio James and I spent decades building. But our portfolio is too conservative," Michael argued. "You're missing opportunities for growth that could significantly increase your wealth. With professional management and more aggressive strategies, that $2 million could become $5 million in just a few years. Or it could become nothing," I pointed out. "Michael, I'm 62 years old. I don't need to grow my wealth aggressively. I need to preserve it so that I can maintain my independence and security for the rest of my life. Taking major risks with money I can't afford to lose would be irresponsible at my age." Michael's facade of professional calm finally cracked. "So you'd rather sit on money you'll never spend than give your children a chance to build something meaningful with it? You'd rather die rich and alone than invest in your family's future? I'd rather maintain control of my own finances than hand them over to someone who sees my money as his opportunity," I replied evenly. "Michael, if you want to start an investment fund, start it with your own money. Prove your expertise with your own assets before asking others to risk theirs on your judgment." "I don't have that kind of capital," he snapped. "That's the whole point. I have the knowledge and the connections, but I need funding to make it work. You have funding, but no expertise in modern investment strategies. Together, we could create something that benefits everyone." "No," I said simply. "I'm not giving you $2 million to gamble with, regardless of how you frame the proposal." Michael stared at me for a long moment, his expression cycling through frustration, anger, and something that looked like genuine hatred. When he spoke again, his voice was cold and measured. "Fine," he said, closing his folder and standing up. "But when you're sitting alone in this house in 10 years, with no family around because you drove us all away with your selfishness, remember that I tried to find a way for all of us to benefit from the wealth you refused to share. I'll remember that you tried to manipulate me into funding your business ventures by disguising them as family investments," I replied. "And I'll remember that when I said no, you responded with threats and emotional blackmail rather than accepting my decision with grace." Michael gathered his documents and headed for the door, but he turned back for one final shot. "You know what Dad would think about this? He'd be ashamed of what you've become. He believed in family, in helping each other, in working together toward common goals. You've turned into everything he despised: greedy, suspicious, and selfish." The words hit their intended target, but instead of crushing me, they crystallized. Something I'd been struggling to understand about my relationship with my children. Michael wasn't trying to honor James's memory or uphold family values. He was using my love for my dead husband as a weapon to manipulate me into giving him what he wanted. "Your father," I said quietly, "would be proud of me for refusing to be bullied into making poor financial decisions. He would support my right to control my own money and make my own choices about how to use it. And he would be disgusted by your willingness to exploit my grief and use his memory to pressure me into funding your schemes." Michael left without another word, and I sat in my kitchen wondering if I'd just witnessed the end of my relationship with my eldest son. The answer came 3 days later, when Sarah called to tell me that she and David had decided to postpone their move to California because they couldn't afford the relocation costs and housing deposits required to make the transition successfully. "We've looked at every option," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "But without some help with upfront costs, we just can't make it work right now. David's company says the offer will still be available in 6 months or a year, so we're going to keep saving and try again later." I knew this was my cue to offer the financial assistance that would make their move possible, and part of me wanted to. I hated hearing the defeat in Sarah's voice, hated knowing that money I could easily spare would solve their problem and help them pursue their dreams. But I also knew that giving them money now would validate Michael's belief that emotional manipulation and family pressure were effective tools for accessing my resources. "I'm sorry it didn't work out this time," I said carefully. "But maybe the delay will give you more time to plan and save. So when you do make the move, you'll be even better prepared for success." The silence on the other end of the line was long and telling. "Mom," Sarah finally said, her voice small and hurt. "Michael told me about his investment proposal. He said you refused to help the family even though you have more money than you could ever spend." "Michael's proposal wasn't about helping the family," I replied. "It was about gaining control of my money to fund his business ambitions. Those are very different things." The conversation with Sarah about California hung between us like a storm cloud for weeks. She'd made it clear that she knew about my wealth and felt I was being unreasonably stingy by not offering to help with their relocation. The disappointment in her voice had been genuine, but underneath it was something harder, a resentment that I was choosing to keep my money rather than solve their problems with it. Danny called the following week with his own version of the same theme. His student loan payments were crushing his ability to save for the future, and he'd calculated exactly how much a gift from me would accelerate his path to financial independence. Like his siblings, he framed his request as something that would ultimately benefit everyone, since a financially secure Danny would be better positioned to help the family in years to come. I listened to all of them, these children I'd raised to be independent and self-reliant, and realized they'd transformed into something I barely recognized. They'd become people who saw my financial security not as the result of decades of hard work and careful planning, but as a resource that rightfully belonged to them. My refusal to automatically fund their goals wasn't seen as reasonable boundary setting. It was seen as selfish hoarding. The breaking point came in June, on what should have been a day of celebration. Danny had gotten engaged to his college girlfriend, Rebecca, and they wanted to plan their wedding for the following spring. Rebecca was a lovely girl from a modest background, much like Sarah's David, and I was genuinely happy about their engagement. They came to dinner on a Sunday evening to share their news and discuss their wedding plans. Danny seemed nervous in a way that immediately put me on alert, and Rebecca kept glancing at him as if encouraging him to say something he was reluctant to voice. "Mom," Danny finally said as we finished dessert, "Rebecca and I were hoping we could talk to you about the wedding expenses. Her parents can contribute some, but not enough for the kind of celebration we're hoping for." Here it was again, the assumption that their financial needs automatically became my responsibility. "What kind of celebration are you hoping for?" I asked carefully. Rebecca pulled out a notebook filled with magazine clippings and detailed budget estimates. They'd planned an elaborate affair at an expensive venue, with all the traditional elements that come with a high price tag. The total cost was more than James and I had spent on our entire first year of marriage. "We know it's a lot," Danny said quickly, "but we only get married once, and we want it to be perfect. We were hoping you might be willing to help make that possible." I looked at my youngest son, the child who'd once been content with simple pleasures, who'd helped in the garden for the joy of growing things, who'd seemed to understand the value of earning what you had. Now he was asking me to fund a wedding that cost more than many people made in a year, not because it was necessary, but because it was what they wanted. "Danny," I said gently, "why don't you and Rebecca plan a wedding you can afford, rather than planning an expensive wedding and then looking for someone else to pay for it?" The question seemed to genuinely confuse them. "But you helped pay for Sarah's wedding," Rebecca pointed out. You hosted it at your house and covered a lot of the costs. I offered to host Sarah's wedding because I wanted to contribute something meaningful to her special day, I explained. That's different from being asked to write a check for expenses you've already committed to without consulting me. Danny's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. So you'll help Sarah but not me? That's not fair, Mom. I didn't help Sarah by giving her money, I corrected. I helped her by offering something I could provide, my home and my time. If you want my help with your wedding, ask for something I can give rather than demanding something I can afford. The conversation deteriorated from there, with Danny accusing me of favoritism and Rebecca looking increasingly uncomfortable as she realized she'd walked into a family conflict she didn't understand. They left that evening without resolving anything, and I could see in Danny's eyes the same entitled resentment I'd seen in Michael and Sarah. 3 weeks later, I received the phone call that would end my relationship with my children forever. Michael's voice was cold and businesslike when he delivered what he clearly thought was an ultimatum. Mom, we've been talking, all three of us, and we've decided that your attitude toward family support is unacceptable. We're giving you one last chance to reconsider your position. My position on what? I asked, though I already knew. On sharing the wealth that should benefit all of us instead of just you. Sarah needs help with her move, Danny needs help with his wedding and student loans, and I need capital to build something that could secure all of our futures. You're sitting on millions while your children struggle, and that's not the kind of mother Dad raised us to expect. The casual cruelty of using James against me had become their standard tactic, but this time it felt different, more calculated, more deliberate. What exactly are you proposing, Michael? We want you to establish trust funds for each of us, $500,000 each. That still leaves you with over $1 million for your own needs, but it gives us the security and opportunities we deserve, as your children. And if I refuse? Michael's pause was loaded with implications. Then we'll have to accept that you care more about money than you care about your children, and we'll have to make decisions about our relationships with you accordingly. There it was, the threat I'd been expecting since this whole conflict began. Give us what we want, or lose us entirely. Pay the ransom, or forfeit your children. I thought about James, about the values we'd tried to instill, about the importance of earning what you have and respecting other people's autonomy. I thought about the life we'd built together, the business we'd grown, the careful financial planning that had secured my future. And I thought about my children, who had turned that security into a weapon against me. I refuse, I said quietly. Michael's response was immediate and brutal. Then you've made your choice. Don't expect to hear from any of us again. You can keep your precious money and live with the consequences of valuing it more than your family. The line went dead, and I sat in my kitchen holding a silent phone, wondering if I'd just lost my children forever over my refusal to be extorted. The answer came 6 months later, on the day of Danny's wedding. I learned about it through a neighbor who'd seen the announcement in the newspaper. They'd planned their expensive celebration after all, apparently finding other sources of funding, and they'd done it without inviting me. The exclusion wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate punishment for my refusal to fund their demands. My youngest son, the child I'd thought would always be part of my life, had chosen money over our relationship just as surely as his siblings had. But the cruelest betrayal was yet to come. It happened on a cold December evening, 2 days before Christmas. Sarah knocked on my door, alone and looking nervous. For a moment, I dared to hope that one of my children had come to reconcile, to bridge the gap that had divided our family. "Mom," she said, stepping into my hallway, "I need to talk to you about something important." I invited her into the living room, where a small Christmas tree sat in the corner, the first I'd bothered with since James died, decorated half-heartedly because the house had felt too empty for celebration. "The boys sent me," Sarah began, and my heart sank. "We've been talking, and we think there's something you need to understand about your situation." "My situation?" "You're getting older, Mom. You're living alone in a big house, managing a business, handling finances that are probably too complex for someone your age. We're worried about your ability to make sound decisions." The words hit me like physical blows. After months of demanding my money and threatening to cut me off when I refused, they were now questioning my mental competence, the classic precursor to attempts at guardianship or conservatorship. "We think it might be time to consider having someone help you manage your affairs," Sarah continued, unable to meet my eyes. "Michael knows people who specialize in elder care planning. They could help make sure your money is protected and properly invested for your future needs." "Protected from what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "From poor decisions, from scammers who target elderly people, from the kind of financial mistakes that could jeopardize your security." The irony was breathtaking. My children, who had spent months trying to manipulate me into giving them money, were now positioning themselves as protectors of my financial security. They were suggesting that I needed guardianship to protect me from exactly the kind of financial exploitation they had been attempting. I looked at Sarah, my daughter who had once saved her allowance to buy me flowers, who had written thank you notes without being asked, who had been my shadow and my joy. And I saw a stranger who was willing to question my sanity to gain access to my money. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I think you should leave now." "Mom, please just consider what we're suggesting. We love you and we want what's best for you." "What's best for me," I replied, standing up and walking to the front door, "is to never see any of you again." She left then, but not before delivering one final message. "Michael wanted me to tell you that if you don't voluntarily agree to financial oversight, he's prepared to pursue legal options. He has documentation of your recent behavior that suggests you're not thinking clearly." After she left, I sat in my living room and finally understood the full scope of my children's betrayal. They had escalated from emotional manipulation to outright threats, and now they were prepared to question my mental competence to achieve their goals. They were willing to destroy my reputation, my autonomy, and my dignity to gain access to money they had never earned. The next morning, I called Vincent Martinez and explained the situation. His response was immediate and reassuring. "Patty, I've worked with you regularly for over a year since James died. You're mentally sharp, financially sophisticated, and entirely capable of managing your own affairs. Any attempt to claim otherwise would be frivolous and easily disproven in court." But Vincent also suggested precautions. We updated my will to ensure my children couldn't challenge my competence posthumously. We established clear documentation of my mental acuity and decision-making capacity. And we put measures in place that would make any attempt at guardianship both difficult and expensive for my children to pursue. That Christmas was the loneliest of my life, but it was also the most peaceful. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for the next demand, the next manipulation, the next threat. My children had played their final card and lost, and the game was finally over. Spring brought new beginnings. I expanded Sullivan and Sons, hired additional staff, and began taking on larger projects. I started volunteering at the library, joined a book club, and discovered that I had friends who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide financially. Most importantly, I learned that losing children who saw me only as a source of money wasn't actually a loss at all. It was freedom from relationships built on exploitation rather than love, from the exhausting work of trying to earn affection through financial support, from the constant threat of emotional blackmail disguised as family loyalty. My children had given me a choice: surrender my autonomy and independence, or lose their presence in my life. They assumed I would choose them over my principles, my security over my dignity. They were wrong. The house is quiet now, but it's the quiet of peace rather than loneliness. I have my work, my community, and my memories of the man who loved me for 40 years without ever seeing me as a source of funding for his ambitions. I have my independence, my security, and my self-respect. My children chose money over our relationship. I chose my dignity over their demands. Some people might say I was too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to sacrifice family bonds over financial boundaries. But those people haven't sat in their kitchen listening to their own children discuss their future, as if they were already dead, haven't been threatened with legal action for refusing to fund other people's dreams, haven't been told that their love was conditional on their willingness to be financially exploited. The woman who raised those children with love and sacrifice and endless patience died on that December evening when Sarah suggested I needed guardianship to protect me from myself. The woman who survived is stronger, wiser, and utterly unwilling to be anyone's victim, even her own children's. They made their choice. I made mine. And I sleep peacefully every night knowing I chose correctly. Up next, you've got 2 more. Standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.